I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go sit, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like.
You might think this is a pretentious, short-tempered filmmaker. Guess again. He is Dennis Nilsen. When he was arrested in the 1980s, he was the UK's worst serial killer. What made his murders especially gruesome? And what led him to take this horribly dark path? Welcome to Crime City. This is the story of Dennis Nilsen, the man who kept his victims' corpses at home for company. Today's story begins in a pretty inglorious way, with a bunch of blocked toilets in Muswell Hill, North London.
An engineer at the time went to attend the blocked toilet, cleared the toilet, but did remark to us afterwards that he'd never smelt such a bad smell in an apartment before in his life.
23 Cranley Gardens was split into several flats, and many of the tenants kept complaining about the plumbing. When a plumber came down a second time, he looked in the big drains under the house. That's when he saw chunks of human meat stuffed in it. So on February 9th, 1983, Chief Inspector Peter J. visited 23 Cranley Gardens. The plumbers had determined that the culprit lived on the top floor of the house, as the plumbing was blocked all the way to the bottom. But Peter still couldn't believe it really was human flesh down the drain, so he asked the plumber to show him exactly what he'd seen.
And he showed me 4 little pieces of flesh, each about 3 inches by half an inch, maybe an inch, and also 3 bones with a knuckle at each end. And my first thought when I saw them was that they were from a human hand.
Imagine seeing and smelling that. Peter learned that the top floor tenant was a 37-year-old executive officer at a job center, Dennis Nilsen. He was away at work, so Peter and his 2 fellow officers waited for him to get back home. At 5:30 sharp, he turned up.
And I remember saying to him, "Mr. Nilsen," and he said, "Yes, that's me." And I said, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J. I've come about your drains." And a little smile came across his face, and he said, "Well, since when have police been interested in blocked drains?"
Dennis continued to play the fool, even when Peter told him there were human remains down his drain, so the detective decided to cut to the chase.
And I just got a little bit closer to him, face to face, looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Don't mess me about. Where's the rest of the body?" And he just paused momentarily, and he said, "In plastic bags in the other room."
Without any further questions, the officers handcuffed Dennis and brought him to the Hornsey police station. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. They would uncover a story that still sends shivers down everybody's spines. We're used to taking people's words at face value, but in the world of serial killers, it's a whole other story.
The confessions are remarkable, not for the candid nature with which he speaks about his appalling crimes, but for the level of self-importance, the grandiosity, lack of empathy, and the narcissism that he displays, all of which are clearly psychopathic traits.
Dennis Nilsen hadn't just taken one life, he'd killed 15 men, and he was about to describe each and every one of them in gruesome detail. But he would toy with the officers, change his story, and make it look like he was the one in charge. He would have killed more if he hadn't been arrested, but now that he was in an interrogation room, the floor was his. He could finally reveal his horrible deeds.
Well, there were 12. There were 15 or 16. When I was back of the police car, heading to the police station at the moment of my arrest, they asked me how many there were, and I didn't really know. I just gave them a figure. And because I was cooperating with the police, I decided I'll stick with it.
As the police questioned Dennis, a forensic team searched through his apartment for more body parts. Their stomachs turned. The whole house was filled with heads, bones, and torsos. In the wardrobe were 2 severed heads and various body parts in plastic bags, surrounded by air fresheners. In a tea chest was a torso and a skull wrapped in newspaper. In a bathroom drawer, there was a whole pelvis and a bunch of legs, but these were just the bodies of 3 men. In a garden in Crinklewood, the forensic team would find remains from 8 more victims. Dennis would be interviewed 16 times over a couple of months. Dennis patiently described every single detail he remembered about his gruesome murders, showing no remorse or emotion whatsoever.
Come the summer, it got hot, and I knew it'd be a smell problem. But I thought, well, I'm going to have to deal with the smell problem. And I thought, what would cause the smell more than anything else? And I came to the conclusion, It was the innards, the soft parts of the body, the organs and stuff like that.
Meanwhile, a team of detectives studied Dennis Nilsen's past. Was his psychopathic, murderous mind nature or nurture? Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Scotland. He was the middle child of a Scottish mom and a visiting Norwegian soldier. But Dennis's dad left when he was very young, so he grew up with his mom, brother, and sister. Sadly, the family was very poor, and Dennis grew into a shy, lonely boy who constantly got picked on by the other kids. Then he discovered that he didn't like girls. The bullying got even worse.
He had a very tough upbringing. He wasn't very popular in school. He came from a poor background. He was bullied. He was aware of his sexual difference. He knew that he was different from other boys, but wasn't very sure how.
Then there was the ultimate tragic event. You see, Dennis's father was absent, but he had become really close to his grandfather. They would chat, garden, and fish together. But his granddad would be away for weeks on long fishing trips. One day, Dennis's mom asked him if he wanted to see his granddad. Dennis was ecstatic. He didn't know he'd come home. When he said yes, his mom took him to the kitchen and showed him a casket. His grandfather was dead, and his mom did not prepare him for it. It was a dark and sick joke to play on a 6-year-old, and this affected him deeply.
Nilsen would later say that when he saw his grandfather laid out in the front sitting room after his grandfather's death, that this was when Nilsen first began to associate love with death, an inert body.
Dennis would then go to the sea and drown himself inches close to death so as to simulate going to see his granddad. He became socially alienated to the extent that he wouldn't even let his own mother hug him. When he was 16, he left home and joined the army, more precisely catering corps. He cooked for his fellow soldiers. That would come in handy later. Aged 27, Dennis quit the army and moved to London, hoping for a more open gay scene. Ironically, he joined the police around the same time. He liked being in a position of power, and he used this job as a shield for his personal life, which he'd learned to be very secretive about. But a year later, he quit the police and began working as a civil servant. Meanwhile, he was making home movies.
What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You never make a cameraman, you know. No. I'm not going to do anything.
But Dennis never really became a social animal. Throughout his 20s and 30s, he became desperate to find a relationship or a companion of any kind. In 1975, he met a drifter named David Galashan outside a pub. The next day, they decided to move in together, renting a place at 195 Melrose Avenue in Crinklewood, London. But Dennis wasn't a pleasant partner.
You're a big nincompoop. Oi, over here. Over here, stand up. How long do you think it'll take me to dig the garden? Don't stand there with your hand on your hip feeling like a big poop.
Everyone who met Dennis said he was self-obsessed.
I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go sit, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like.
Within a year, Dennis kicked David out of the house. Now he felt lonelier than ever. On the evening of December 29, 1978, Dennis met a boy in a pub. His name was Stephen Dean Holmes, and he was 14, but he told Dennis he was 17. The two drank together until the early hours of the next day. Then, Stephen went home with Dennis, and they ended up in bed. But the next morning, Stephen wanted to go home, and Dennis didn't like that one bit. Something clicked. Dennis grabbed a necktie and ended him. Then he drowned him in a bucket. But this is not where it ended. This is where it began for Dennis.
Once the murder had occurred and Nilsen had before him a corpse, he then, in a very peculiar fashion, looked after the corpse.
Dennis kept Stephen's body in his home for 7 months. He cared for the body as if for a lover. He would bathe it, change his clothes, and put it to bed. During the daytime, he would move it to an armchair so as to let it watch TV with him. When the body was too decomposed to live with it, Dennis moved it under the floorboards. 7 months later, he burned it on a big bonfire in his garden. Now, Dennis had a new thirst for murder. He began targeting poor, lonely gay men and inviting them home, the kind that no one would report missing.
He's tackling a particularly vulnerable group that many other serial killers target.
11 young men would die in Dennis's Melrose Avenue home. In a strange and tragic twist, Dennis would only kill those he liked the most. If he didn't like their companionship, they could just leave his home. If he wanted them to stay, he was so afraid they would leave him in the morning that he would strangle them. Then he would take care of their corpses like they were his most precious lovers.
After he killed them, he would sometimes bring them out and put them in a chair and have conversations with them, as if they were still alive.
They can watch television with him. He can talk to them.
The most exciting part of the little conundrum was when I lifted the body, carried it.
Finally, Dennis could have companions that didn't talk back. The need for control is the dark truth behind most murderers.
I would say that he wanted the bodies to be there because it assured him how in control he was of other people. This is what is arousing to an individual like Nilsen.
Dennis would also violate the corpses, then dismember them into tiny bits that he could hide in plastic bags. Every now and then, he would burn the body parts along with old tires to mask the smell. In 1981, Dennis moved to 23 Cranley Gardens, but when he tried to kill another man, he failed. 21-year-old Carl Stoddard woke up after Dennis strangled and drowned him. Then Dennis proceeded to bring him back to life, doing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and heart massage.
He told me that what happened was I got caught up in the sleeping bag set, and that was it. And I believed him, because you don't think that somebody's going to try and kill you. Anyway, he did.
So Carl didn't report this to the police. Dennis would kill 3 more men at the new address. There was a problem. There was no space for bodies under the floorboards here. Dennis would boil his victims' skulls and get the flesh off, with excellent butcher skills learned in the army. But even so, he couldn't dispose of his bodies anymore, so he started flushing them down the drains. And the rest is history. In November 1983, Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life in prison. The bodies of his victims continued to be identified well into the 21st century, including the body of his first victim in 2005. Dennis showed no remorse for his murders up until his death in 2018. He was an unpleasant prisoner, often making official complaints about the staff or other inmates. Once, he even complained that the gay softcore magazines he'd subscribed to had graphic images. Dennis was proud. He even bragged to the police that he would have killed many more had they not arrested him.
He told me off the record that if it hadn't have been 15, it would have been 150 if we hadn't caught him when we did.
Was he born a psychopathic murderer, or did his context make him one?
Nobody is born with an inevitability about his future. The future is shaped by the experience. It may shape the gene which is flawed, but that is not the same thing as saying that there is evil inherent.
Dennis went through difficult times as a young person, but so did many other people. Yet he turned into a monster that still shocks people to this day. Hey, thanks for watching. What do you think about this case? Did nature or nurture play a bigger role in Dennis Nilsen's dark history? Write us a comment and remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.